So welcome everybody to tonight's event featuring Professor Donna Murch from Rutgers speaking on the movement for Black Lives from Oscar Grant to COVID-19. This talk will be followed by comments from our discussants Joanna Ando and Dr. Niantara Anderson. My name is Anna Reisman. I direct the Program for Humanities in Medicine at the Yale School of Medicine, and I am thrilled to be co-hosting this evening's event along with my colleague and friend, Dr. Helena Hansen. Dr. Hansen is an associate professor of psychiatry and anthropology at NYU, and for several years, she has been running the wonderful and amazing Social Medicine in Action series here at the Yale School of Medicine. It was Helena's excellent idea for our two programs to collaborate on an event focusing on the history of Black Lives Matter and related movements, and especially to invite the splendid Donna Murch. And with that, I will turn over the mic to Helena.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eastman. So it's really a pleasure to introduce Donna Murch. I had the pleasure of meeting her 7 years ago as part of a conference on the war on drugs that she organized and that profoundly shaped my own scholarship since then. She's a powerful voice both in academia and also a public intellectual. She writes widely cited articles for the popular press as well as academic presses, and that's kind of a rare combination. I couldn't think of anyone better to give us a rich her story, as she would put it, as opposed to history, of the Black Lives Matter movement and the international outpouring of protests and support for ending police violence in Black and brown neighborhoods, and also defunding the police and redirecting the billions of dollars that have been spent on law enforcement in Black and brown neighborhoods towards things that actually are promoting of human welfare, and particularly in those neighborhoods that are deserving of so many reparations for the injustices of the war on drugs and other police actions there. She's associate professor of history, and as she would put it, her story, at Rutgers University. She's currently completing a new trade press book entitled Crack in Los Angeles, Policing the Crisis and the War on Drugs. So for those of you who might not know, trade press means that she's going to be publishing a book for a popular audience as opposed to an academic audience, which is an impressive feat. It actually is not easy for academics to cross over that way. So I can't wait to see what she does with that book. She has a forthcoming book of essays that will be published later this year entitled Assata Taught Me, State Violence, Mass Incarceration, and the Movement for Black Lives. In October of 2010, she published the award-winning monograph, Living for the City, Migration, Education, and the Rise of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, with the University of North Carolina Press, and that won the Phyllis Wheatley Prize in December of 2011. She's written for the Sunday Washington Post, New Republic, Nation, Boston Review, the Chronicle for Higher Education, Black Scholar, and the Journal of American History, as well as appearing in Stanley Nelson's documentary, Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Donna Murch, and at the end of her talk, we'll also hear about her discussants and have an opportunity, hear from her discussants and have an opportunity for questions and answers, which will require you to use the Q&A button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Thank you so much, Donna Murch, for joining us. I'm going to unmute you.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and thank you so much, Helena, for inviting me. Your work has also deeply influenced my work and the work that you've done on white opioids, harm reduction, and this interpreting it through a racial capitalist lens. It has deeply influenced me, not only in my writing, but also in my teaching. So today I'm going to talk about the movement for Black Lives. And because I am a historian, that means I'm going to talk about it in a longer trajectory. And I'm actually going to go back to think about the parallelisms between what's going on during the urban rebellions in the 1960s and then the developments of mass incarceration in the 1970s. So it's a way to think about this current mobilization being a response not just to police violence and police killings, but to the real escalation and production of something that a new generation of historians has called the carceral state. So this movement is so important because it's not only talking about state violence and killings, but linking it to these systems of control, incarceration, deportation, And it's a way to open up a question about state-sanctioned violence. So I wanted to start just with some images from the protest of course, George Floyd, and also of Breonna Taylor. One of the things that I think is incredibly important to this history is thinking about the way that gender has operated, both in the contemporary movement, but also in how the victims of state-sanctioned violence have been understood. The current urban rebellions are really, I think in some ways they've taken us all by surprise in their scale. So one of the things that I think is important about them is that they've taken place in over 400 cities. So the geographic range and then the temporal range, so that these protests continue to go on. I live in Philadelphia, and there are all different kinds of wildcat protests going on all the time, on bicycles, on foot, car caravans, and I think this is going on in many cities throughout the United States. So in total size and geography and in time, these rebellions are larger than the ones in the 1960s. Many of the comparisons have been made to them, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that they share, but also the ways in which they differ. So the late 60s is a time where many of the protesters were able to make claims on the state. And much of the expansion of funding, the development of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the funding of cities, that in many ways these rebellions won major concessions from the federal government. Of course, today we are facing something very different. So you may hear a little background noise. I have a very bored Chihuahua as my coworker, so I apologize right now for the noise she will be making. But one of the big differences, I think, is that even though we have this mass scale of protest, it's also a question of what that relationship is both to electoral politics, to municipal, county, and state, and then also to the federal government. So I think it makes perfect sense to look to the historical analogs to what's happening today, but then also to think about what the current limitations are and how those might change in the coming year. Here I have an image of Breonna Taylor. And so when I talk about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, I want to put them into the same frame, because we've had killings of both Black men, Black women, and non-binary people. And I think it's important as we talk about these mobilizations to think about how state-sanctioned violence affects all different parts of our community. Here we have another image of Breonna Taylor, who was killed by police in her home in March 2020 after they broke in with a no-knock warrant. This is a powerful image that comes from a memorial in Ireland, also remembering George Floyd. Another important dimension of what's going on in the protests today is that there are these international solidarity networks that happen very much like during Ferguson in 2014. So we have these mass rebellions inside the United States, but then we also have people trying to construct solidarity networks in other parts of the world. So I want to start just by thinking about how we place what's happening right now in a longer trajectory. And I think the most direct comparison is with the Watts Rebellion. So there's a period that happens in American cities. It starts really in Birmingham in 1963. There's a successive protest that gets called the Harlem Riot. I actually like to use the word rebellion because these are in many ways organized protests that are about trying to target systems of power and structures of violence. So these urban rebellions, they begin in 1963, 1964, but the largest one, and it is actually at that time in 1965, it is the largest urban rebellion in American history, takes place in Watts, California. And at the time, Watts is roughly between 95 and 100% Black. It has a police force that is nearly all white, but it initiates a civil disturbance that goes on for 4 days. The airport of LAX, Los Angeles Airport, is shut down. And then you have the deaths of between 50 and 60 people, overwhelmingly African Americans who were killed by the police and the National Guard. But Watts inaugurates a whole new era, really, in the Black freedom struggle. People often talk about it as being the transition from civil rights to Black power, but we might also understand it as its geographical range. So one of the striking things about Watts is that it happens after a major victory. So it happens less than a week after Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. And that's important because this is essentially the legislative fulfillment of a portion of the Southern Civil Rights Movement, which is about dismantling the system of economic and political segregation. It is also the first time that African Americans en masse can participate in electoral politics. And I want to stress that because it's very recent, our participation. So we talk about the United States as the oldest democracy in the world, but actually African Americans have really only had the vote since 1965. You had select voting in the North, but African Americans in the South are completely shut out. And it's really in the second Great Migration, as people move from the South to the North, that they gain greater access to voting. But in terms of the total Black population, we have only been able to vote since 1965. So it is this moment of accomplishment for the Southern Civil Rights Movement. But what's striking about Watts is that it breaks out just a week after. And at the time, people talked about it in terms of the geography of Black struggle, that the dismantling of legal segregation is the focus in the South, and the core mode of protest is nonviolent civil disobedience. But the North and the West, I would argue, is actually the struggle that's most resonant for today, which are largely questions of race and economics. So it's a question of housing, education, and jobs. So these are really questions that entail private property, the redistributive mechanisms of the state, and they're much harder to fight for because they require, to some extent, questioning the core of structures of power in the US. So even though we really celebrate the Southern Civil Rights Movement as a kind of national way to understand how race functions in the United States, I would argue that it's actually looking at the North and West after 1965 that really speak directly to the kinds of problems that we're facing today. Housing, education, and jobs on the one hand, and then police violence and state-sanctioned violence on the other. So when the Watts Rebellion breaks out, one of its major effects is that it makes populations visible that were previously invisible. And one of the things that's really striking about thinking about Watts versus today is that in the 1960s, there was incredibly vicious backlash against this. And the racial demographics of the protest is that they were overwhelmingly concentrated by African-American populations and often in Black parts of the city. That has a lot to do with the dynamics of policing also and how these rebellions are shaped through how the National Guard is deployed, what areas of the city people can protest in and which ones they can't. So the discourse that was often used about them was that they were irrational. And in the 1980s in particular, when Ronald Reagan expanded the second drug war and defunded American cities, many people pointed to the urban rebellions as the reason for urban decline and divestment, is that it was a product of the rebellions. But if we go back and we look at them, it's very clear that they won major concessions. And this is really important. You have hundreds of thousands of people that participated in these urban rebellions in the 1960s. And as a result, Lyndon Johnson in his single term is president. He is a Democratic president who supports Vietnam, but also supports the expansion of a marginal welfare state, both of Medicare and of really the extension of federal provision to localities. So even though Johnson is so reactionary on Vietnam, he still is able to make concessions to the scale of protest that we see. So it's out of the urban rebellions that the Department of Housing, is created. The Department of Housing and Urban Development is created. And that's really important. So they win concessions, economic concessions about increasing funding to American cities. So in that sense, I think the urban rebellions can be understood quite differently, that they were a way to call attention to problems that couldn't be addressed by the usual electoral process. So the kind of debate that we're having right now about what is the language that we use to talk about protest other than nonviolent civil disobedience? There are precedents for this absolutely in the 1960s. So like the dynamic that we've seen today, these other forms of protest that include property destruction really did wring concessions from the state. And I think that that's one of the biggest questions right now when we're thinking about protest in the age of COVID. which is that we have seen an elimination of so many different aspects of the redistributive state. The United States today, compared to 1968, has a much stingier welfare state. And so in the 60s, people were able to win concessions. And I think one of the big battles, longer term, not just short term, under the Trump administration, it's going to be impossible. But if we have a Democrat elected in November, one of the big questions is going to be, how do we have real economic commitments made and redistributive commitments, as well as fighting for things like defunding the police and then reinvesting that money in community. This image I have is from 1968. And it is taken from the protest that Martin Luther King was visiting of sanitation workers in Memphis the night before he was killed. So I wanted to show it because you will see echoes of this protest in the kinds of demonstrations that we've seen over the last 10 years. Another important point about 1968 is that you have the first wave of protests that begins in the early 60s, Birmingham, New York, and then Watts. And Watts really inaugurates a whole new set of ideas and politics. So you have the birth of the Black Panther Party a year later. You have the birth of the US organization and the Black student movement in California and other places. So in some ways, these urban rebellions that are so demonized by the media become really a kind of dynamo for creating new types of politics that are stepping outside the tradition of just narrow electoralism or nonviolent civil disobedience. So I think you can see some of the echoes from 68 and what's happening today, but I'm also, when I get to the contemporary period, I'm gonna talk about that more. Another element of 68 that matters is Black Power iconography. So of course, from the Black Power protests in Mexico City, this becomes one of the dominant images of the two sprinters with a protest organized by Harry Edwards. It's a powerful image of Black power, but is also a masculinist ideal. And I think one of the things from the late 60s is that much of the ways in which this state violence is understood is through really its effect on African-American men. And I think that this is also echoed today. And part of it has to do with this historical moment of the 1960s. So you have Huey Newton, who's the founder of the Black Panther Party, who is one of the first and most important political prisoners of this period. You have the Mexico City protests. You, of course, have the leadership and then the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. So kind of the iconography of the movement often focused on male leaders, both coming out of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. Another important element in the 1960s is that as you had the mobilization of the Black left and the Black Panther Party, they understood urban rebellions inside the United States as linked to an anti-colonial movement that's taking place in Africa and other parts of the world. So one of the big differences between then and now is, of course, this is at the height of the Cold War, where the United States is fighting hot wars throughout the global South, and of course, the war in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. So inside the United States, people that are supporting armed self-defense and these other forms of politics, they linked the violence against Black people at home. They initially talk about Black populations inside the United States as colonies who are occupied. And this, I think, is one of the most important representations of this. So you see, this is a political cartoon from the Black Panther newspaper. It shows the linkages between local police, National Guard, and Marines. And the billy club that's being carried is napalm. So this is an argument that the kinds of domestic violence that we see at home is related directly to the imperialist ambitions and really the methods of warfare. So it's linking the idea of napalm with CS gas. So there are strong international dimensions, and that's one of the things that's also powering the late 60s protests, that in many ways you have what radicals consider successes. You have the Cuban Revolution, you have these multiple countries winning their independence. They're looking also to Ho Chi Minh and the kinds of mobilizations that you're seeing in Southeast Asia. So it's taking place at a time when also the United States' imperial ambitions are being attacked. And in some ways, this is the only war that's really ended by mass mobilization of the population at home and also of members of the American military, many of whom, well, many of the Black Panthers actually were ex-military. So in the 1960s, these protests are very much the domestic United States is also linked to its foreign policy, which is quite different than today. So 68 is the moment of kind of the high tide of Black power, also very important in the anti-war movement, but it is also a harbinger of what is to come. So you have the election of Richard Nixon, who runs on a platform of law and order. And it's this vision of law and order that really dominates the last 50 years. And it starts with this advocacy. I'd say that as a kind of political campaign and as the core of his appeal, it is Nixon who launches law and order. But the idea doesn't start with Nixon. So Lyndon Johnson, when he runs for president in 1964 and is elected, he starts a war on poverty, but he also describes the war on poverty as simultaneously a war on crime. So the seedbeds for what Richard Nixon calls law and order does start with a Democratic president. And of course, if we were to go further back in history, I'm talking about really the immediate post-war history of the United States, but this disproportionate criminalization of Black, Brown, and Indigenous populations stretches back even before the formation of the American Republic. So we could have a longer discussion about where these ideas come from. But by the 1960s, even a liberal like Lyndon Johnson is important for coining the term war on crime and seeing it linked to the war on poverty and also state concessions to the Black movement. So this idea of law and order, it does not start with Richard Nixon, but Richard Nixon really transforms this into political gold, as does Nelson Rockefeller. And it's used as a way to really peel off the white voters in the Democratic Party who begin to leave once African Americans are being seated and incorporated into the party. So 68 is kind of a high tide of Black power, but is also a harbinger of the responses to the 1960s, both to the Black Power movement or the Black movement, and also the real anger that's generated in the white population at seeing African Americans and others winning new rights. I think that you can't understand what's happening with Trump without going back to this period. It's obviously a formative period for both Donald Trump and his father. And in many ways, the vision of law and order politics that he's using, it's taken from this playbook of the late 60s, the 1970s, and then, of course, Ronald Reagan. So it's in this period that we see the articulation of a silent majority. And without going into the details of it, what's important about this is it's an argument that the country needs to be taken back, that there has been too many gains have been won by these other populations. And so it is a major moment of white revanchism. And it's this spirit of revanchism that we see is going on right now. And so you have this mass mobilization of these protesters that are multiracial. So the composition of the protesters is different than in the 1960s. During the 1960s, overwhelmingly, the urban rebellions are African Americans. By the time you get to the urban rebellions in Los Angeles in 1992, the so-called Rodney King rebellions, you do have a more racially mixed, mainly Black and Latino, but also some white protesters. But one of the big changes is seeing large numbers of white participants today. But what's going on along with the protests we're seeing today is also, of course, a revanchist counter-mobilization, which is the real base even of the election of Donald Trump. So this is why this discussion about the silent majority, and the idea is that the white population is becoming marginalized, that the successes of African Americans, essentially everything that African Americans gain is considered a loss for white people. So it is this zero-sum vision of any gain for others is a loss for them. This includes Medicaid, youth services, senior citizens, and then also the increases in the rights in criminal defendants. So in thinking about what people are protesting against today, it is this edifice that emerges in the last half century, which is really a war on crime. And included within that larger umbrella of the war on crime is the war on drugs. So Nelson Rockefeller is important to this story, as is Richard Nixon. And it's in this period, in the early 1970s, that we begin to see the takeoff of mass incarceration. So that periodization is important, that it is in the aftermath of the African-American freedom struggle, the winning of the right to vote, the dismantling of the system of Jim Crow, the passage of the Civil Rights Act. It is in this period after that we begin to see a shift from the Democrat to the Republican Party, essentially white flight into the Republican Party. And what comes along with that is this popular campaigning based on crime. This is important throughout this period because as we move away from explicit invocations of racial discrimination, more and more there's a colorblind language that doesn't use the language directly of race, but offers essentially dog whistle politics. So crime increasingly becomes a way to actually talk about Black struggle and Black rights. So this really takes off starting in '68 and then throughout the 1970s. So a generation of historians have begun to write this history of the 20th century and to think about this kind of change and shift in state resources. And they've called this the carceral state. So it's a phrase that's taken from Foucault, from his Discipline and Punish that's published in 1974. And it's a way to talk about the kind of shifting use of resources and how to explain why the United States ends up with the largest prison system in the world, the most people that have ever been incarcerated, and essentially a scale of commitment to punishment that is unlike any other country in the world. The important thing about this is that it is so linked to the political developments. So it emerges at the tail end of the African-American movement in the 1960s and 1970s. John Ehrlichman, who worked for Nixon, talked explicitly about the utilization of the war on drugs as a way to respond to political protest. And essentially what he says is that you couldn't make it illegal to be Black and you couldn't make it illegal to oppose the war. But what you could do was target these populations who are seen as the real agents of change in the society and to criminalize drug use. So in many ways, the discourse of drugs and drug consumption becomes a very important tool of political repression. And Ehrlichman, who was interviewed by the brilliant journalist Dan Baum in the 1990s, so 30 years later, just readily admits to this, that there was a portion of the war on drugs that was explicitly political, and it was about targeting specific populations. I would also add that one of the major tools that's used by Ronald Reagan when he runs for governor. So in many ways, Ronald Reagan's candidacy for governor of California in the 1960s is an anticipation of what's going to happen in national politics in 1980. And he runs on a platform against beatniks and rioters. Those are his words. And those words are really a way of creating a cultural war in which he's making an appeal to a white population against people that participate in urban rebellions and people that oppose the war. What's disturbing about this is that it has a kind of echo, not only through the 1980s, but straight to today. The majority of union households in California vote for Ronald Reagan for governor, even though he opposes unions and thinks that California should be a right-to-work state. So this kind of demonization of anti-war, anti-imperial protest, and then Black people, not only in the sense of racism against Black people, but also against their political action and their centrality as fighting for expansion of rights, not only for themselves, but also for a broader welfare state, for in many ways, a more just and redistributive government. So they pay a very high price. So here you can see just the statistics on mass incarceration. You can see the rising numbers by 1968, and then really that takeoff in between 1982 and 1986 when Ronald Reagan comes into office. This piece is important because although punishment and we'll call it racialized incarceration, has been a marker of US history all the way back to its origins. It vastly increases in scale in the 1970s up through really today. I mean, you see the numbers are still rising, and there's a slight leveling off only around 2014, which is the period when we have the Ferguson protests and some of the Obama administration implements criminal justice reforms. So I want to emphasize this because I think that the current movement for Black Lives is really, it is the protest movement and the organized political movement to try to fight this enormous system of punishment that has come to be. One of the issues that I've had as a historian, my first book is on the Black Panther Party, but I'm writing this current book about crack and the war on drugs. And one of the things I was really struck by was the difficulty in people mounting a resistance to the war on drugs and the war on gangs in the 1980s and 1990s. You had groups of, especially in places like Los Angeles, you had former Panthers and Black radicals and a kind of coalition of people fighting this, but it was very hard to get popular traction. And one of the things that has been incredible to see in my own lifetime is that it takes a while for people to figure out exactly what these systems of violence are. So what's being rolled out from, let's say, the late 60s, early 70s through today, it has elements to it that are different than what had come before. And so I think that that's the first major point that I want to make, is that this is a movement that has found a language in order to express the scale of violence against Black people. So it starts with police killings, but it is also a way to shine a light on this entire punishment apparatus that includes harassment, extraction through fines and fees, jailing, incarceration, and the regimes of violence that exist within that. So the movement for Black Lives, I think, has created a very powerful lens and way to mobilize against this. Here we have our statistics on race and incarceration. So you can see the profound differences. And it's in this period that is essentially producing the kinds of structures that have resulted in 1 in 4 African-American men under some form of correctional control, and Black women having exponentially higher rates of incarceration than white women. One of the really disheartening things about talking about this is that it has been a bipartisan project. So in that sense, even though African Americans were incorporated into the Democratic Party after 68, they really don't fully have voting power until 1968 and after. But both the Republican and the Democratic Party have been important to building essentially the apparatus of mass incarceration. So Ronald Reagan is incredibly important in this story. He creates the second war on drugs. You have the Lyndon Johnson, who creates the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, but then it's vastly expanded by Nixon. And you have a relationship really between Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and then Bill Clinton, that there is a kind of continuing escalation of the war on crime fought, especially through the war on drugs, but not only that, through the use of mandatory minimums and federal funding for state, county, and municipal police, as well as providing funding for building more jails and more prisons. So the war on crime is led at the executive level. So the federal government gives away incredible amounts of money to local jurisdictions. Another important piece of this is that starting in the 70s, but really I'd say the Clinton administration is most important in this, we begin to see the dismantling of what had been the New Deal welfare state. So in the last 50 years, one of the only ways for local municipalities to get money is often through crime prevention money. So it's a kind of double whammy where in the Reagan era, you see the defunding of the monies that had been won in the 1960s. And the only way for localities really to recoup this money is often to participate in federally funded crime prevention strategies and essentially carceral policies. Bill Clinton is very important in this. It is under Bill Clinton in the 1990s that we see the single biggest expansion of the numbers of people in state and federal prison. I wanted to show a map of Ronald Reagan's election in 1984 in order to really explain the shift towards this carceral policy. So in 1984, Ronald Reagan is elected with every single state except for Minnesota. And Minnesota is actually Walter Mondale's home state, which is why it is the only blue state. But it's this win by Reagan in 1984 that really convinces the Democrats that they have to out-Republican the Republicans. And it's in this period that you have the development of the New Democrats, of which Clinton is a very important one, and really the attempt to steal the kinds of propaganda and that had been so successful for the Republican Party. And one of the biggest ones is jettisoning politicians like Michael Dukakis that oppose the death penalty and embracing this new, even more intensified regime of law and order. So it's in this moment, in this response to the kinds of victories of Ronald Reagan, not only his deregulation of, really deregulation of business, his cutting away of the regulatory state. And you see, of course, Bill Clinton, who learns from this and becomes a new Democrat. And not only does he vastly expand mass incarceration, he also eliminates the Glass-Steagall Act that had been passed during the 1930s in order to prevent the kind of crisis that we saw in 2008. So the kinds of structural violence and institutional racism that we're seeing the movements mobilize against today, this has come from both political parties. And one of the big questions is, what do we do now? We are all, well, I shouldn't say we, I can't make assumptions for everyone, but many of us feel that it is essential to vote for a Democrat against Donald Trump. But we are also faced with the truth from our recent past that the Democratic Party has also supported these incredibly repressive policies. And I think that that is one of the reasons that we're seeing much broader and widespread support, not only for criminal justice reform, but also for prison abolition, which I will be talking about in a minute. This is just an image from, no talk is complete without an image from Banksy, the street artist. But this is, I think, a really powerful argument about the 1980s, both about the use of crack as a justification for the war on drugs and linking it to the financial crisis and deregulation. So that combination of financialization and punishment. So in talking about bipartisan support for the war on crime, Joe Biden, unfortunately, is an essential part of this story. He is the co-sponsor of the Clinton crime bill that's introduced in 1994, which vastly expands mandatory minimums. It actually allows for the death penalty. It calls for the death penalty for drug trafficking kingpins for particular kinds of offenses. And it is some of the very worst anti-crime legislation that we have ever seen. Joe Biden introduces this legislation, he lobbies for it, and he is quoted as saying at the time that when we look back in history, the Democratic Party will look like J. Edgar Hoover, and the Republican Party will look like Abby Hoffman. So I think that it's worth thinking about this history given the choices today, both for massive grassroots protest and its importance given the electoral history about fighting war on crime and this carceral apparatus that emerges in the last 50 years. So I wanted to lay that out as kind of the general structure for thinking about what these protest movements are responding to. And now I'd actually like to talk about the protest movements themselves. This is a beautiful mural of Oscar Grant, who was a young man from Oakland who was killed in 2009 in Fruitvale Station by Johannes Messerling. And this is a mural that was convened in his memory. I think that I start my story with Oscar Grant rather than Trayvon Martin because, one, I'm a historian of Oakland, and so I was intimately aware of this protest movement before it received any national media coverage. And I think that there are other precedents for this. There's, of course, organizing against Eleanor Bumpur's killing in the 1980s. There are a whole series of police killings that take place before 2009. But I remember witnessing the scale of mobilization around Oscar Grant where you had these new coalitions being built. And for the first time, they were using social media. Well, the first time I became aware of it, they were using social media in order to really broadcast and create this alternative media to talk about Oscar Grant's killing. His mother also played, very much like Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Till, played a really important role in maintaining his memory and that political work of broadcasting what happened to her son and working with different groups of people to mobilize against it. So it's in Oakland that you have this ongoing mobilization of people sharing through social media the killing because it was caught in cell phone footage, and calling for the firing of Johannes Messerling and also for reparations. And what was interesting about this coalition is it brought together a lot of different people in it. There were people that I knew that came from the Panther Party, the kind of 1960s generation of radicals. The Nation of Islam became involved. And then you also had the not-for-profits and NGOs and grassroots organizers who become important in founding the Black Lives Matter network. So it was really the scale of protest and pushback. And this is the first time that I saw this kind of model being used about using a police killing and fighting for justice for the family as a way also to talk about systemic and structural violence of police and prisons. Here we have a picture of Oscar Grant with his mother and the family 10 years later. So I would like to move forward to talk about the organizing around Trayvon Martin, because I think that the formation of the Black Lives Matter network comes out of direct protest from Trayvon Martin. And I also want to introduce some groups that aren't talked about as much, including the Dream Defenders, who got a lot of coverage at the time when they held a protest inside the State House, but they've continued organizing and remain really important to this kind of grassroots mobilization. On February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old boy with a slight build and easy smile, left his father's fiance's gated residential community in Sanford, Florida, to purchase Skittles and Arizona iced tea from a local 7-Eleven. That night, Martin happened to be wearing khaki slacks cuffed at the ankle and a dark hooded sweatshirt, a detail that would be entirely unremarkable were it not for the meta-narratives that were brought to bear in the months to come. On the way back from the store, George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old insurance underwriter who had a history of reporting Black boys as young as 7 to the police, began stalking Martin with a 9mm handgun. Local authorities knew Zimmerman well. He had repeatedly called 911 as a self-appointed neighborhood watchman. He also had a record as a criminal defendant that included school suspension. By contrast, Trayvon Martin had no history of priors. Zimmerman's own racial status was somewhat ambiguous. He identified as Hispanic on census forms. His mother was born in Peru. His father was a native-born former Army sergeant. And an important piece about this story is, of course, the Florida Stand Your Ground laws. Empowered by Florida's Stand Your Ground laws, Zimmerman had taken it upon himself to track people he viewed as potential intruders to the majority white housing development. This section of Florida's criminal statute on the use of deadly force and home defense states explains, quote, a person who is not engaged in an unlawful activity and who is attacked in any other place where he or she has the right to be has no duty to retreat and has the right to stand his ground and meet force with force, including deadly force, if she or he reasonably believes it is necessary to do so to prevent death or bodily harm. While Zimmerman never directly invoked this law in his defense, his entire case and actions that evening drew upon its suppositions, as did the national deluge of racial violence against Black people that bridged both autonomous vigilante acts like law enforcement and private security firms. Strikingly, the Stand Your Ground laws elaborated an older set of common law doctrines known as the Castle Doctrine, but extended them in key ways beyond the actual protection of one's home to one's physical self, one's personal property, such as wallets or automobiles. As indicated above, the law expanded the right to use deadly force in, quote, any other place where he or she has a right to be. So the Stand Your Ground laws, this is probably history that many of you know, they're supported by ALEC and they become essential. So it's a place where you have this intersection of white vigilante violence with legislative changes that have been made by organized lobbying. So the important thing that I would say about thinking about Trayvon Martin is that the way that he becomes a political symbol that people mobilize around, and it is in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin and then the acquittal of Zimmerman, that we see the mobilization of the Black Lives Matter network. Most observers of what has come to be known as the Black Lives Matter movement trace its origins back to Martin's murder and Zimmerman's acquittal in July 2013. The spontaneous mobilization of Black youth across the country, knitted together through bonds of social media, represented a burning moment in what civil rights leader Bernice Regan Johnson has described. You also had not only the Black Lives Matter network, but also the founding of the Florida-based Dream Defenders and Black Youth Project 100. In a story that has become political legend, the founders of Black Lives Matter coined the phrase that journeyed from hashtag to political network and ultimately to an expansive umbrella term for Black youth protest of the early 21st century. In July 2013, during the disorienting aftermath of George Zimmerman's acquittal, in which his defense team tried Trayvon Martin posthumously by accusing him of drug use and thuggery, Alicia Garza posted a powerful impromptu commentary on Facebook, quote, "The sad part is there's a section of America who is cheering and celebrating right now, and that makes me sick to my stomach. We got to get it together, y'all." She continued on to saying, quote, "Stop saying we are not surprised. That's a damn shame. I continue to be surprised at how little Black lives matter, and I will continue that. Stop giving up on life." Garza concluded, "Black people, I love you. I love us. Our lives matter." Fellow Los Angeles organizer Patrisse Cullors recognized the transcendent phrasing and shortened Garza's post into a Twitter hashtag, Black Lives Matter. Soon Garza and Cullors reached out to Opal Tometi, who set up Twitter and Tumblr accounts under the new phrase, whose use steadily grew over the next years, peaking in the aftermath of Ferguson street protests. While the collaborative hashtag activism of Black Lives Matter quickly went viral, it mattered that Garza, Cullors, and Tometi all had extensive experience in the world of progressive not-for-profits and substantial social media followings. In 2012, Garza worked as the executive director of People Organized to Win Employment Rights, POWER, before assuming a position as the project coordinator for the Oakland office of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Patrisse Cullors headed up Dignity and Power Now, a small not-for-profit group that advocated reform of Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, and Opal Tometi served as the executive director of Black Alliance for a Just Immigration. In 2014, 2 years after the founding of the Black Lives Matter hashtag, Alicia Garza described the political vision of the organization, quote, "Black Lives Matter is a unique contribution that goes beyond extrajudicial killings of Black people by police and vigilantes. It goes beyond the narrow nationalism that can be prevalent within some Black communities, which merely call on Black people to love Black, live Black, and buy Black, keeping straight cis Black men in the front of the movement, while our sisters, queer and trans and disabled folk, take up roles in the background or not at all. Black Lives Matter affirms the lives of Black queer and trans folks, disabled folks, Black undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. It centers those that have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. It is a tactic to rebuild the Black liberation movement." So this is part of the Black Lives Matter Her Story that Dr. Hansen was referring to. So it's incredibly important that this movement really came out of a female, queer, feminist lens. And it was, I'd say there are many different kinds of protests going on around the country, but it is around this network of experienced organizers that we really have almost the invention of a new way to understand and make visible struggles that had been taken for granted. And I think that that's one of the most important insights, that the killing of Black people by police is so common that it had become taken for granted. And the question was, how do you get people to no longer assume that this will happen and to shine a light on it and to mobilize anger? And my argument would be that it's actually the combination of organizing and the development of this new lens. This is the only way to understand these mass rebellions now. These had an incredible impact on a whole generation of young people and organizers, but also the people behind them who are participating now in the urban rebellions. So this imagery, this is where my book title comes from, and it was very common in between 2012, but especially like 2014 to 2016, to see people using the slogan, "Assata taught me." And Assata is a Black Panther and member of the Black Liberation Army. She was a rank and file Black Panther who came from the New York area with family who were originally from the Carolinas. What's striking about this is just the continuity of historical memory, that the invocation of Assata Shakur as a New York Panther, that she's the one who most shaped the imagination of this movement. The reason that I think that she was so important is that she was a political prisoner who had 5 separate trials, who had been incarcerated in the late 70s, was broken out of prison in 1984, became a fugitive, and currently lives in Cuba. So she became really important as an example of fugitivity and literal Black liberation. And it is the idea of Assata and also her words that is used in many of the different organizations that I mentioned, in the Black Lives Matter Network and BYP 100, the Dream Defenders. So this is an example of the continuity from the late 1960s through today, not through the leaders and founders of the 2 men who started the Black Panther Party, but actually through a rank and file party member from the New York chapter. A big part of, I think, how this network was able to mobilize large numbers of people was to talk about the killings of Black children and to place this killing of Trayvon Martin within a longer history against all Black people, but also against Black children. The culmination, I would say, of this network really takes place in Ferguson in 2014. So these are some famous images that come from the use of military hardware. So we see the use of Kevlar, of tanks, of CS gas, and this image essentially of the American war machine being turned in on its own people. Again, this image of seeing the most vulnerable of children and others and everyone subjected to this became incredibly important. In terms of talking about the militarization of police, the use of military surplus and also the training of the police in military techniques and the recruitment of ex-military into the police was an essential part of this movement. Ferguson was the moment that brought all of these different groups and networks forged as far back as Oscar Grant, but really vastly accelerating under Trayvon Martin. And I went to Ferguson during this period to observe, to participate, and to document. And all of the people who became active in the subsequent movement were all in Ferguson. So it became a convening point. It also became very important for the Black Lives Matter network, because up until that point, you had the individual organizers, 2 in California, 1 in New York, who were working for their own not-for-profits. But it's with the convergence on Ferguson that we actually see the development, not only of having a hashtag, but having direct organizing. So Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, Opal Tometi, and others, they organized freedom rides. So that what they did is from their own individual locations, they set up bus rides so people could come from all over the country into Ferguson. And this is why you saw this scale and visibility of protest. An important thing to note about this is that the Ferguson protest went on for years. So you have this period that's in August and then later with Ferguson, October, where you see lots of outsiders coming in and participating. But it's important to note, and this is one of the ways that the urban rebellions are different from the national campaigns, the people that really maintained and staffed these protests, every day there were protests in front of the police station in Ferguson, in the place where Michael Brown had been killed. But this was literally, you had networks of protesters from the local area who came every day, that created their own transportation where they would pick each other up and people would protest the police, 20 hours a day. So it's that on the ground grassroots organizing that has always been core to this movement. Another important thing I thought was really important for Ferguson. When I was there, I was really struck by how many people were formerly incarcerated. And part of the way that the carceral state and this carceral regime worked was to instill people with shame about having been incarcerated. And these protests provided an opportunity for people to come out and talk about what the experience of prison was like, and to really view it as something not that was inherently about their mistakes, but to think about the extraction of fees and fines, the criminalization. So the protests themselves became a way for people to think more broadly about how their experience intersected with that of Michael Brown and other people killed by the police. So those protests themselves became really important incubators for a new generation of activists. One of the things that I'm thrilled by to see is that we are only 6 years later. And from the things that I've seen of the current contemporary protests, we're seeing a similar dynamic. So we have a generation of people, in this case, a generation is only 6 years, but a generation in the sense of this foundational moment of the Ferguson protests, also, of course, in Baltimore and Charlotte, really, really important. And then the court organizing going on in places like Chicago and Florida. Helen, can you tell me how much time I have left?
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute. So this is so important, Donna. We're about 9 minutes over what we estimated, but I want you to take the time you need to wrap up.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to show you these images because they're so important. One of the things that happened in Ferguson was collective punishment. And what this is this is the complex. It's called Canfield Green, where Michael Brown lived. And the thing about Canfield Green is that it was actually quite beautiful. It was covered in this like gorgeous tree cover. St. Louis is just like rich and green and lush. It's right on the Mississippi River. And one of the things that the police did is they came in and they cut down all of the trees, ostensibly to allow the helicopters that were flying over to be able to see into people's houses for weapons. But I just wanted to show you those images because the scale of violence that was directed at Ferguson and longer term is really a very painful piece of this history. Here I have a picture of the Black Lives Matter her story. So obviously Alicia Garza to the left, Opal Tometi in the center, and then Patrisse Cullors. This is another mural. There are a series of powerful murals that have been painted about Assata Shakur. This one is actually in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. And Assata remains this living symbol that is essential to the movement. So the poem that I mentioned, there's a poem that Assata publishes. It's in, I think, the late 1980s. And it is essentially the incantation that is used to open the movement for Black lives. And it is our duty to fight for freedom. It is our duty to win. We have nothing to lose but our chains. We must love and protect one another. And I wanted to show you this image from Ferguson. And what's striking about this is that there was a self-consciousness also about that history and a memory about the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis. This was a very common sight in many of the protests. And people are speaking directly to this question of what is the role of women? Not only what is the role of women in leading the movement, but also inserting, as Kimberly Crenshaw has in her Say Her Name campaign, about the killings of Black women and Indigenous women as also being important to mobilize around. So one of the single most important things about the movement in, I'd say, 2012, maybe through the election of Trump, was the strength and the power of the queer feminist lens. And I think that it is in dialogue, in many ways rhymes with the 1960s, but this is a difference. You always had large numbers of women participating in the organizations, both civil rights and Black power organizations. But women were not always the upfront leadership, whereas one of the really exciting things about the movement for Black lives is its queer feminist lens. This is an image from a Ferguson protester, now long-term organizer, but I wanted to show you this image because in some ways, this is the beauty and the contradictions of this moment. So if you'll notice, she has a list of all of people that have been killed by the police, and they are all men. And one of the interesting things to see was the kind of evolution of how people began to understand this, where you have a protest movement largely staffed and run by women, but yet still dealing with that question about why the killings of women don't receive the same attention as the killings of men. And that is why I opened, and also non-binary people like Tony McDade. So that's also why I opened first with an image of Breonna Taylor and then with an image of George Floyd, so that we're thinking about how people mobilize, that these killings are taking place, but it still remains an open question why we haven't seen the same mobilization around women's killings as men, especially since this is a movement that has so much been led, and really the kind of intellectual work of the movement has been done by women, many of them queer women. Here we have another image of Assata. This is a beautiful mural from Detroit that is actually inside a building. So the animating spirit of Assata is incredibly important. I want to call people's attention to this document that was produced in 2017. And I think this is a kind of central clearinghouse for the convergence between the idea of prison abolition, so not only fighting for criminal justice reform of the kind that we saw in the First Step Act, but asking core questions. What is the function of a police force? Why do we need a police force? Why are police forces taking on work that would be much better done by social workers and by the state providing people with the resources they need to live? So the Vision for Black Lives is released in 2017, and it is an amazing clearinghouse of hundreds of pages of policy prescriptions, of organizing techniques, of drafts of legislation to center around ending the war on Black people, and also thinking of strategies of defunding the carceral apparatus of the state and then reinvesting in community. So it's not only the ending of the punitive, but it is also about ways to think about providing communities with the resources that they need. And I just wanted to end with this image of Breonna Taylor so that we hold her in the same frame as George Floyd, and also make sure that the killings of all Black and Indigenous people that we think of, both women, men, and gender non-binary people. And I would like to conclude just by talking about where do we go from here? So the first is the question of 2020 versus 2014. And this explains also the title of my talk. I think one of the big differences with 2014 is that there are several. The first is that because of the sheltering in place orders, the composition of the protests is very different than it was in 2014. The protesters tend to be much younger. And I know there were many people, myself included, and many people I know that were involved, not only in our local protests that actually went to major places of protest to support and to document. Much of this was made impossible by COVID-19. So I think that the sheltering in place has affected the demographics of the protests. That's the first thing. The second thing is the structural disparity in health outcomes, I think, is a major driving piece of these protests. So in some cases it's being directly addressed, in many cases it isn't, but the scale of pain and the scale of suffering that made people in the middle of a pandemic go out to protest another pandemic of state violence. So I want to underline that, because I think that there are enormous opportunities to think about how to talk about health and state violence in new ways. And I think that the disparate outcomes with 2 to 3 times the death rates among African Americans and Latinos, both because of structural health disparities, but also their role as essential workers. So these core economics about who has to go to work and who can stay home. So you have coercive measures that were put in place, particularly in the Republican states that opened up early, that essentially by opening up, they made it possible for whole swaths of workers not to receive unemployment insurance. So that was its own form of compelling people to work. So I would love to, I'm very excited to hear the discussion. I saw they're going to talk also about the kind of protests that you saw at Yale, but that question of where does public health disparity fit into this mobilization? It's really important and it needs analysis, and it is different than 2014. The second thing is claims on the state. One of the real problems we have right now, certainly with Donald Trump in the White House, but this will also be an issue if we elect Joe Biden as a Democrat, is how do we make real claims on the state at a time when the American economy is so precarious. Arguably, we are more precarious than the aftermath of 2008. We're in the worst financial shape since the Great Depression. How do we make claims on the state? The federal government, in many ways, is completely left out, not only of COVID planning, but the utter impermeability of the federal government. Because one of the big successes of the 1960s that is too little talked about is that it wrung these major concessions from the state. And I'd say the final point is thinking about prison abolition and defunding the police. So when I talked about that moment in the 1990s where Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are appropriating the strategies of the Republican Party, it is also out of this period that we see the real birth and growth of the prison abolition movement. So Ruthie Gilmore holds a conference at UC Berkeley in 1998, and Angela Davis and a series of largely women in Northern California and other parts of the country really started a dialogue that was going to launch the prison abolition movement. Its roots go back to Angela Davis's writing about abolition in the early 70s, and there's a larger queer feminist history that needs to be written in the earlier period. But certainly the 1990s are the explicit founding of critical resistance. One of the most exciting things about this moment is that we are now talking about abolitionist strategies even in the corporate media. So the power and the success of this movement has been remarkable. And I think to understand it, we have to trace it back going at least to the 1990s with the development of prison abolition, but also the beginning of these campaigns in 2009 with Oscar Grant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Murch. That was amazing and thought-provoking and just really, really fantastic. I will now introduce our two discussants who will speak each for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have opportunities to hear your questions for the remainder of the event. And I realize we are a little bit off schedule, which is fine. We can stay on a little bit after 8 o'clock for your questions. So our first discussant is Joanna Ando, who is a fourth-year Yale medical student. She is the former co-president of SNMA and LMSA, two student organizations, and she was a student organizer with Next Yale in 2015. And she's going to tell you more about all of that work. Our second discussant will be Dr. Niyantara Anderson, who graduated from Yale School of Medicine this May. She's currently an intern in the Yale Department of Psychiatry. She's a co-founder of Next YSM, the co-leader of the History, Health, and Humanities Working Group, and co-founder and executive committee member of Rebellious Psychiatry, also known as RebPsych. So again, please use the question and answer function to pose your questions, and we will get back to you after these two have spoken. So thank you so much.
Hello? Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, I'm just trying to turn on my video. Okay, perfect. Okay, hi everyone. I first off want to say thank you to Anna for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to Professor Murch for such a thorough and thoughtful timeline about, again, kind of the evolution of the movement of Black lives and how in some ways it's more of a deja vu and it's more of an evolution of what has been going on. And so it's been beautiful to see that. And I love the historical perspective as a medical historian as well. What I've been invited to do today is introduce and kind of share a little bit of my experience as a Yale medical student, but also an alum of Yale College, particularly during the major protests of November of 2015. And I had a few points from Professor Murch's talk that I wanted to speak to in terms of my experience with student activism, with organizing and evolving as there's been a growing list of names, and how even for myself, I remember where I was when I first learned about Trayvon Martin, who was born in the same year as me, was in the same grade as me, and how my sense of activism has evolved as I've become more entwined with educational institutions. So I guess the main 3 points that I want to touch on are, again, what Professor Murch mentioned as questioning structures of power, and how particularly in the 60s, so particularly with the rise of the Civil Rights Act and this kind of second reconstruction and this almost trying to reclaim the rights that were never instilled among the Black population well after the Civil War. And I also want to talk in terms of my second point is this idea of visibility, and this idea of minority groups or once silenced group becoming more visible in the state of activism and advocating for their rights. And then the third point I want to mention is the incubation for new protesters in this timeline, particularly in the 2000s up until now. So I'm going to share my screen because I have a few pictures that I want to show. Okay, and can everyone see that okay? Is that good? Okay, great. So like many things that begin, I wanted to show this picture from the 60s. I'm gonna just do this right here. So this is an image actually from San Francisco State College in 1968. And it was a large movement of protest that had happened among the largest cohort of minority students that were accepted at the time, which was a predominantly white institution. And largely influenced by the Black Panthers, as well as activists such as Stokely Carmichael, there were students who saw it fit to protest both the Eurocentric curriculum on campus, the lack of Black studies, as well as the lack of diversity. And so in terms of talking about the precedents of student activism, I wanted to show this image as well as another image to show how I think a lot of students who have progressed in terms of organizing at institutional spaces use these pictures and use these experiences as a jumping off point and as for inspiration. This is another image. This was actually a Pulitzer Prize winning photo, and it was of students of Cornell who had taken over in Willard Straight Hall at Cornell University. And this was actually a 36-hour takeover where armed students in 1969 were again protesting racism, protesting the inadequacies of their institutions, and demanding change in a way that they saw fit, given the rise of all the turmoil in the 60s. And again, this was more so for the establishment of Black Studies program, because at much of this time, there was a cohort of minority students who were admitted, but not necessarily the infrastructure for students who wanted to learn about their history, learn about their place in terms of these institutions. So I wanted to show just a few of these news clippings because as we talk, I think a big part in the movement of Black Lives Now has been centering on the naming of spaces and statues. And I think a lot of the protests that happened in 2015 started to touch and skim a lot of these different issues, particularly with Calhoun College. So Calhoun College was a former residential college on Yale University. It was erected in 1930, and it was named after John C. Calhoun, who was the vice president during John Quincy Adams. And he was an avid proponent of slavery. He protested it he advocated for it on the Congress numerous times. And this college had been built in the 1930s and was named after him. And there had been waves of protests or expression of student dissent as to why it was problematic to have a college named after a white supremacist. But it wasn't until 2015 and a series of serendipitous events that caused this to become something on the national stage and something that was worth debating. And so just looking at this skim of newspapers, there were a few catalytic events that had put the issue of John C. Calhoun as well as other issues to the forefront at Yale as well as other universities. So there was the issue of free speech, as well as a controversy around Halloween costumes, particularly an email that was sent by the Intercultural Affairs Committee, just advocating for students to consider the costumes you may wear before you set off on your Halloween festivities, questioning, if it might be offensive, maybe reconsider wearing it. In response, the then assistant master of Silliman College, my residential college, Erica Kostakis at the time, who was a professor affiliated with the Yale Child Study Center, had sent an email in response questioning the bounds for that email, questioning whether students should need that type of censorship. And just in a short quote, she said, Nicholas, her husband, who was the master of Silliman College, says, if you don't like a costume someone is wearing, look away or tell them you are offended. Talk to each other. Free speech and the ability to tolerate offense are the hallmarks of a free and open society. So the discussion around considering if your Halloween costume might be offensive transitioned to more of a free speech debate and the idea of the right to be offensive, to be provocative, and at what cost, or I guess what space does that have on a college campus? So that was an entirely other conversation that was happening. And then at the same time, there was an article that had been published in the Washington Post about a student approaching a Yale fraternity and being told that the party was only permitted to white girls only. And so this had kind of been catapulted to the national stage. And overall, just inciting the idea that there were racial tensions, that there were issues and conversations of race at Yale, and many people kind of wanted a bird's eye view as to what were the inciting events and why was this happening. So again, these are various newspaper clippings that were going on at the time, but it was very catalytic in that way. And meanwhile, there was a critical group of students who would then be known as Next Yale, and started to create a list of demands and started to corroborate their own stories of racism, of prejudice, that at a predominantly white institution, they hadn't necessarily had the space to describe. And at this time, with all these events, minority students, low-income students, indigenous students started to realize that their experiences were not a coincidence. Their experiences were not something to be ignored, but were rather a representation of how institutions such as Yale play a part in dismantling or upholding structures of anti-Blackness and racism. So a lot of that had culminated into the March of Resilience that had happened in November. And as you can see, again, Professor Murch had mentioned too, there were a lot of young students, young people, a lot of students. And this was very serendipitous at the time. In the age of social media, we had been meeting offline, we had been meeting in classrooms, we were communicating through email chats, and it was all towards the efforts of trying to create a coherent voice as to what we saw as the inadequacies of the university, what we saw as an institution that boasts of inclusion, boasts of diversity, but still housed both structural, implicit, and explicit forms of hostility or, I guess I want to say, uncomfortability. So it was amazing to see this group of students that were able to gather around. And again, there was a lot of serendipity with it. And this is one of the main images on cross campus that had happened. And Next Yale had crafted, again, more of a rough list of demands, but one of the main ones was the establishment, or trying to establish ethnic studies, which was known as ethnicity, race, and migration, as a distributional requirement for all students. Trying to allow more mental health care professionals, particularly that were well apt to issues of being a minority student at a predominantly white institution. Another demand was increasing the annual budget of each cultural center, which prior to these protests had nearly been consolidated as a type of multicultural center over the argument that there somehow wasn't a need for these spaces anymore. And I think one of the fourth demands that caused a lot of attention was renaming of Calhoun College, which again, had been protested in the 80s, had been protested in the 60s, but always seemed to be washed away. And at that time, there were 2 new residential colleges that were meant to be erected, and the demand was to have those to be named by people of color as well. And then number 5 include the removal of Nicholas and Erica Christakis from Silliman College, who at the time had poorly managed the I want to say the aftermath of conversations of free speech and kind of the conflation with the issues that had been going on campus. So, and at that point, many students had felt uncomfortable. And then number 6 was the allocation of resources overall to support people of color, first generation, and low income. And I just want to just highlight number 6, because I think as we talk about the movement of Black lives, especially when it comes to defunding the police, I think that language is evolving in the sense of trying to look for a sense of equity, trying to, again, reallocate resources that are meant to nourish historically underrepresented kind of cast aside groups, and trying to reallocate those resources in the effect of equity. And I just wanted to show a couple more images. And at that time, I was an undergraduate, but the medical students had also coalesced and had protest related to white coats for Black lives. Again, more in solidarity, but also creating representation. And so overall, I just want to kind of highlight the wider effects of these movements, as well as what had been going on a national scale. At the time, there were also protests at Princeton, who had been notably protesting against the Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy, which in the news was just recently decided to be renamed by Princeton. But at the time, students were protesting again the racist origins of Woodrow Wilson at Princeton, and kind of demanding for change that many students had been asking for in the past. In addition, there were protests at the University of Missouri, notably the football team had gone on a hunger strike, again, joining largely in solidarity of just the racist events that had happened on their campus in particular. Meanwhile, by this time in November, there were at least 21 college institutions that had crafted a list of demands that were presented to their college presidents and other administrative faculty. So this had become kind of widespread. And I think, again, looking at this as a little over a year after Ferguson protest and the evolution of looking at police brutality, student organizing, I think a lot of this was catalytic in some sense and almost happened in sequence. And then looking at Yale in particular, Calhoun College was renamed. At first it was decided for the name to be kept, but about 2 years from these protests, the college was named after Grace Hopper, who received her PhD, I believe, in mathematics from Yale. And then one of the new colleges was named after Pauli Murray, who was a graduate of Yale Law School and a queer Black civil rights activist, as well as a lawyer. And then in terms of just a few other institutional changes, there was a Yale Center for Study of Race and Indigeneity and Transnational Migration, which was just an interdisciplinary research center that was that funding was allocated for. But in terms of an ethnic studies distribution requirement, that was not fulfilled, as well as elevating it to departmental status. So a lot of the times we saw after these protests too, much of the progress was incremental. And at times, having a public eye, having national newspapers, having national attention, I think put a lot of pressure on the institution to realize that, you know, as a national institution, they were showing some type of example to other institutions, example to the government, example to just other people that were looking from the outside in. And then I just want to mention one other change. Another point of contention was the title of master, which was delegated for administrative faculty within the residential colleges. And for a long time, people of color, students had been voicing they're voicing how in some ways that term was problematic. And by the end of these protests, that term master was also taken away and replaced with head of college. So this was, for me personally, my first experience with organizing and activism on more of a larger, broader scale, and learning how to articulate in what ways we can demand for change or be agents for change. And moving into the medical school and working alongside the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, as well as older students such as me and Tara, I was able to, again, build more vocabulary and a toolbox for how to be more efficient in demanding for these type of changes. So that is pretty much, yeah, my main outline as to what is going on. I've already seen some questions in Q&A, but I think we wanted to transition to me and Tara to talk a little bit about kind of the evolution of Next Yale as well as Next YSM.
I think I need permission to start my video. Okay, there we go.
Okay, I'm gonna start.
Hi, everyone. I'm gonna try and share my screen, so bear with me while I try to do that. Hopefully everyone can see this. So I want to begin by just mentioning some friends from medical school who work closely with me as part of this activism that I'm going to highlight briefly. So that's Robert Rock, Amber Anders, Sydney Green, Herbert Castillo, Marco Ramos, Carrie Flynn, Max Jordan, Brianna Olamiju, and of course, Joanna. And I want to recognize the work of medical students currently on the Committee for Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Justice at the School of Medicine. And before I get into that history, I just want to jump off Joanna's point and draw a line even further back from the San Francisco State protests, all the way back to Black students' protests against racist white administrators, patronizing and racialized student codes of conduct and Eurocentric curricula that took place at HBCUs such as Howard and Fisk as early as the 1920s and 30s. So I just want to take a moment to hold up this really long and often overlooked history of on-campus Black student activism. I'm going to try and fly through the parts about activism at the med school because I really want to respond to some of Professor Murch's points. So here you see in the first slide some of the students who were here before I matriculated at Yale School of Medicine, which I'll refer to as YSM from here on out. This is in 2014 with the White Coats for Black Lives organization. And you can see, I want to just draw your attention to, this is protesting police brutality. And I just want to draw your attention to the police who are lingering in the back of the protest right there. I don't know how they got there. That's Robert Rock. And I don't know who called them because we kept the organizing of this protest very secret, but they were there. And it's interesting that they felt they had to be there for a peaceful protest of medical students who were unarmed. But yeah, there they are. And I think it's worth taking notice because I think I'll return to this point about the police being there at protests later. I also, just by contrast, I want to show this picture of a white student who organized a protest, not against police violence, but in support of the Affordable Care Act and the notable lack of policemen at this particular protest. So just to point that out. So then in 2015, the White Coats for Black Lives protests continued at the Yale School of Medicine. This is when I matriculated here in the fall. And while these protest movements were going on, as Joanna mentioned, there was a movement on the undergrad campus in response to the Christakis' racist Halloween comments. And given that there was momentum for White Coats for Black Lives in the med school already, when Next Yale started, it was incredibly important to us, and it kind of galvanized everybody to do something more specific to Yale, to address the problems right here at Yale. And what happened was we started a group called Next YSM. Next YSM was a kind of ad hoc group of students, both Black and people of color, but also white allies. And they were organized to write a set of demands for the Dean Administration of Yale School of Medicine. And we distributed the demands by disrupting a dean's town hall We read the demands out loud, and then the people at the town hall engaged in a discussion about them. We then posted the demands online and collected signatures in support of them. And, you know, we kind of staged repeated protests over the ensuing weeks until the administration met with us. We had teachings, we had organizing committees, all of this. I just want to point out that doing this kind of work was not without consequences at the institution. I'm sharing an email that I received from a fellow white medical student who, you know, is kind of pointing up the animosity and isolation that white students are feeling in this moment. Here's another email where a white student wrote to us personally in our personal emails and, you know, cited the fact that they felt they were going to be targeted, they were going to be labeled as discriminatory, and how, you know, they felt like they were putting their heads out on the chopping block, which I thought was a really interesting analogy. Here's some reactions from the administration. They had a panel titled, "Should I wear my white coat to the rally?" And I didn't attend this panel because I knew the answer was going to be a resounding no, and the people who went confirmed my suspicion. So, so then we moved to 2020. We made some progress since Next YSM 2015, but we hired a dean of diversity, we restructured the curriculum, we commissioned portraits of the first 3 Black women to graduate from the Yale School of Medicine, and we reformed the Office of Student Research, but the faculty at Yale remained overwhelmingly white. Students grew tired of laboring thanklessly on committees that seemed to sort of drag their feet. And the atmosphere of hostility and discrimination towards people of color at the med school just persisted. If anything, it worsened. And so what happened is we got XYSM reconvened in 2020 and crafted another set of demands. And these demands also expressly address Yale's relationship with the police and the Yale Police Department, and also armed security on campus. And this is basically we tried to set up a Zoom protest because we could not do it in person because the Dean's Town Hall in 2020 to address the protests around the country and around the world really for Black Lives Matter was a Zoom protest, a Zoom conference. So we had to sort of think about what a Zoom protest would look like, and essentially we came up with this idea that we would go to the town hall, and about 15 minutes into it, we would, you know, start reading the demands. And then asked everybody in the town hall if they supported the demands to change their profile picture to this image of a fist with a stethoscope, which is actually the same image we used back in 2015 when we staged the Next YSM protest, and then to sort of flood the comments with the line, ysmdemands.org, we demand action. So this is a couple of screenshots from the Zoom protest. If anyone wants to sort of see what that looks like. And this is what some of the screens on the Zoom protest look like. I'm not going to get into the demands in detail here, but you can access them online. Again, they address some of the longstanding complaints that we've had about Yale, and it also very, very explicitly asks Yale to sever ties with the New Haven Police Department and to abolish the Yale Police Department, and then to sort of terminate any and all armed security on the Yale campus. So just a little plug for the demands. They're at ysmdemands.org. Hopefully you'll read them and consider signing. But I kind of sped through that because I want to respond to some of the things that Dr. Murch said. And before I do so, I want to share a little bit about my positionality as an individual, because I think it helps frame the reaction I had to Dr. Murch's comments. So I did not grow up in the United States. I was raised in Sri Lanka, a formerly colonized nation, and I came to the US when I was 13. I mention this again because it informs the comments I'm going to make. The land that the US was founded on has not been returned to the native people from whom it was stolen, and it remains largely under the control of the descendants of European settler colonizers. And I think this is something that we can all agree with. And so given that reality, it is from my vantage point, the US is still a European colony. And people who know me know that I say this all the time. And hence I consider its institutions, such as medicine, universities, prisons, and the police, to be colonial and colonizing institutions. And so to return to a point that Professor Murch brought up earlier, the fact that the Black Panthers framing of the US as a colonized space, I want to focus a little bit on the US police as a settler colonial apparatus, right? Because the main task of a settler colonial police force, and in the US, a settler colonial police force in a slave society, its job is to subdue and subjugate its colonial and enslaved subjects and maintain the colonial hierarchy. And it does this through violence, visibility, and vigilance, right? Violence, that is, the police exerts unpredictable violence on colonized and enslaved people that usually goes unpunished and keeps colonized and enslaved people in a state of terror. Visibility, that is, the police are a constant visual reminder of potential threat to colonized and enslaved subjects, whether they're in their own native quarters or if they wander into the colonizers' neighborhoods. And vigilance, which is the police's constant patrolling and surveilling of colonizers' lives and properties, and the colonized bodies, culture, homes, and organizations, and in particular, vigilance and surveillance over revolutionary anti-colonial organizations that threaten the colonial state. So in this framework, the settler colonial police is essentially the civilian face of a colonial paramilitary rule. And when I think about that, it seems to me that the US police operates in precisely this manner. And that's perfectly illustrated by a lot of Professor Murch's scholarship that traces the militarization of the police in response to the racial justice rebellions of the 1960s and 70s. So by responding to resistance with police hyper-militarization, the US behaved less like a democracy, responding to citizens' needs, and more like a white settler colonial state, tightening its grip on its colonized and or enslaved Black and brown subjects. And this is why I appreciated Professor Murch's use of the term rebellion earlier, because that term has often been used to describe the uprisings of colonized people throughout the global South. And her image of the deforestation in Ferguson is also uncannily reminiscent of the defoliation of the forests of Vietnam. So I think these parallels are actually, very obvious. And although it may have evolved phenotypically, the US police's core DNA remains that of a settler colonial police force in a slave economy. It is a direct descendant of the US nation state's policing and caging of Native Americans. It is the heir of the Southern slave patrols, and it is a brother in arms of the KKK. And it continues to be an admiring cousin of white vigilantism, both past and present. And as Naomi Murakawa asserts in her book, The First Civil Right, the primary civil right that Black people in America fought for as citizens in the early 20th century was protection from lawless racial violence, right, of white lynch mobs and police. And then, again, to Professor Murch's point about the government reacting to racial uprisings, in the 1940s, after World War II and Black rebellions such as the 1943 Detroit riots, Northern liberals, again to Professor Murch's point that liberals have a bigger, and Democrats have a bigger role to play in this than we might want to acknowledge, Northern liberals like Truman claimed to be reforming the American police in order to protect Black people from white violence such as lynchings. But they were in fact laying the foundations of the modern carceral state, because the way they wanted to protect against white violence was not by reforming white citizens, but was by criminalizing violence and giving the police the ability to respond to violence with violence. In doing so, although the post-World War II liberals criminalized lawless lynch mobs, they simultaneously empowered the US police to become the new lawful agents of terror and racial violence against Black people. And so And so I think that is why. I think it's because there's such a direct line between the contemporary US police force and the various sort of militarized methods of subjugating and oppressing Native and Black people in the United States. I think that is why, because of this direct connection, because the well is poisoned at the source. I think that is why people believe that abolishing the police is necessary. It's not sufficient, but that it is a necessary step in the continued fight to dismantle the United States white supremacist settler colonial society that we still live in today. I think that was the main kind of reaction that I had to Professor Murch's talk, which was this idea of drawing of returning to the idea from the 1960s and 70s that of the US state as a colonial power, and so it can be fought with decolonizing tactics and methods. So that's it from me. I'm gonna stop the share. So yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Professor Murch.
So Anna Reisman and I were going to trade off the questions and answers. So I'll hop in, and I just want to say that was so amazing. All three of you, I just have to say, I learned an immense amount. And so we do have a number of questions here in the Q&A box. I know that we're beyond the time that we had estimated. Some people may need to leave, but I sense that there are a lot of people who'd like to hear answers to these questions. I'm going to go in reverse order, and Dr. Reisman, please chime in if you have any comments on this. But there's a comment from Stefan Weissman. The killing of George Floyd sparked protests not only in the US, but also internationally, from I Can't Breathe murals in the ruins of Idlib, Syria, to the demonstrations of tens of thousands of cities in Munich, from Munich to London. Of course, part of these protests were aimed at addressing racism and discrimination in the respective countries. However, not only the slogans and language, signs written in English appeared to be more common than those written in the country's official language, and the content demands to address police brutality and racism in the US. So the question is, I wonder what you predict, if any, about the effects of international protests on domestic policy in the US. And this is a question I've been carrying around too. I'm very curious about the international nature of protests these days, and the significance for us in the US that it's become international, but also the significance in other parts of the world. So maybe I'll direct that question to begin to Donna Murch. And then if Nyantara Anderson or Joanna Ando have comments also.
I can start, and then maybe Nyantara and Joanna can help me out. You know, the mural that I showed of George Floyd is from Ireland, and that's really important. I think that it's hard to say because I haven't had a chance to research it. You know, there's that part of me that's a historian that's always hesitant to comment on something I've watched happen without really researching it more deeply. But I can say what my impressions are. It really does matter that Donald Trump is president and that we have this global movement of the authoritarian right. That I think that is also crucial to understanding the multiracial protest inside the United States. The dynamic is very different. I didn't talk about this, but it's implicit in what I was saying. So when this movement takes off, of course, Barack Obama is president, and there's the possible sympathetic ear of having a Democrat, but also, as Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor argues, this election of Barack Obama raises the sense of hope and possibility. And initially, the Obama administration continues the same war on drugs policy. I mean, Eric Holder is by no means a progressive prosecutor, or as are other people that we might talk about who are in positions of power during the Obama administration. But the hand is forced by the Ferguson protesters. So it is, and other people as well. So it is this grassroots organization that the Department of Justice responds to, and that's when you begin to see the elimination of federal asset forfeiture and consent decrees for local police departments. So to say, I think that the fact that Trump is president is really, really important because in some ways he's become a global symbol for racism, white supremacy, and the authoritarian right. So of course there are the connections, as much as Trump is capable of even establishing a connection with any other human being. But, of course, with Bolsonaro in Brazil and, the head of Hungary and these other authoritarian right-wing leaders. So I think that partially what's being articulated as anti-racist is also a pushback against the kind of anti-Semitic, deeply racist authoritarian right. And I think that that is true within the US and outside. That might be where I would start.
Thank you. I wonder if the discussants have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I guess I have one thing to add. Just that question kind of highlights to me, it was actually a tweet, some of you guys might have seen it, but it's by Javad Zarif, who is an actually Iranian diplomat and academic, and he was basically outlining a letter that was originally written by the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, in regards to injustices happening in Iran. And there was a little twist on it in which he canceled out many parts in terms of Iran basically committing acts of injustice and unfairness to their people, and crossing that out and putting the US and kind of inserting racism as a kind of look or a mirror shining upon the US, and kind of demanding a larger conversation about the world against racism. So I just wanted to tie that in terms of this international aspect. And I think, again, the way that the world has been watching and also responding to this in both protests and demonstration form, I think is going to shine a mirror on how domestic policy is further carried out, as well as international policy and the idea of enacting policy on other countries. So again, I just wanted to speak to that.
What occurs to me is, again, to return back to this moment, right, in the 70s, where there was this sense where people were really aware of the sort of commonalities that they had, as well as the differences. And again, we're thinking about this in the lens of the global South kind of as a whole. And so that's what it kind of reminds me of, seeing these protests all around the globe. In the 60s and 70s, there was even something called, there was Dalit solidarity with the Black Panthers, which is the untouchable class. In India, there was a whole organization that was called the Dalit Panthers, who organized under that symbol, who openly voiced their support for the Black Panthers. And I think that right now we're seeing similar kinds of recognition across and over the sort of white European colonial nation state boundaries and all the technologies that are designed to keep people from coordinating. And I'm thinking about people like Trump and Bolsonaro, and reflecting on Dr. Murch's points about, race liberals. I sometimes worry that figures like that will become foils to distract from the ways in which white liberals, white moderates, and also, Black and POC respectability politics is not the only, but is a really important engine in terms of perpetuating white supremacist colonial hierarchies in countries around the world. So that's, I think, sort of the tension, is that I do think that these extreme figures have been galvanizing forces, but I also worry that they are smokescreens in some ways, or decoys.
Thank you. So just looking at the time, I want to consult with the speakers and also with Anna Riesman about, should we maybe combine the remaining questions into one and allow each of our speakers to have some parting thoughts on them? Yeah? Okay, so there's a question from Luis Marcano. Within the realm of your profession, how do you ensure your continual mitigation of overt and covert discrimination and oppression of free Black thinking and success? So that's one question. And also, how do we begin to address the racist legacies of revered figures like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Elihu Yale, etc.? That's from Chinye Icheli. Apologies for the pronunciation. And then from Paul Lombroso, in the case of Ferguson protests, I think a discussion of the details of what happened are important. Brown was alleged to have robbed a store, identified on video, refused to obey a police officer, grabbed his gun, was shot in the leg, and then ran, and then confronted the officer. This should be a part of this discussion. I don't know that there's a question there, but three fairly different questions, but or comments, if you'd like to give us your parting thoughts on those, maybe starting with Donna Murch.
Um, Maybe I'll start with the last. One of the reasons I wanted to show those images about the trees being chopped down that also Nintara talked about, the scale of collective punishment that was involved in Ferguson is really important. And it is also that scale of collective punishment led to the kind of mobilization that we see. So, you know, this question about who is deserving and undeserving, taken into the realm of who deserves to live and who deserves to die. So one of the most disturbing things about the posthumous prosecution of people that have been killed is that it is literally raising the question of who deserves to live. The representation of Michael Brown as a criminal has largely been debunked. And with each of these killings, we see an attack on the memory of the people that have been killed. And that in itself is part of, you have the violence, the literal material violence and killing and disproportionate death rates. But then you also have the kind of epistemic violence that erases their memory. And so I don't think you can understand one of those without being in conjunction with another. One of the things that I am so happy about, and I never thought I would see the scale of this in my lifetime, is that we are moving away from questions of innocence and guilt to talk about structural regimes of violence. And we're seeing a broad-based mobilization that has really inverted the lens and focused on these large structures of violence rather than the flaws of the individual people that have been used as a justification for their killing. And I think we have to sit with that.
Thank you. Did you have any responses to the other questions about the racist legacies of figures at places like Yale, or about in your profession, for example, history? How do you work against oppression and discrimination in your discipline?
I mean, one of the things, like, I feel very, very fortunate in my life that I have landed at a place like Rutgers University, that's a public university that has one of the oldest Africana Studies departments in the country. So their Africana Studies department is founded in 1969, and Tony K. Bambara participated, Amiri Baraka, and many of the other Black Power figures. So I feel as if we stand on the shoulders, or we rest on the shoulders of our ancestors. And so for me, the joy of being a historian is that joy of the reclamation of our own histories and the use of oral history also to listen and to learn. So I think I differ from many historians, including some of the historians who are involved in the debate of Calhoun College. I take great joy in seeing these Confederate figures physically pulled off their pedestals and dragged through the street in ignominy. I think this is an incredibly important and powerful symbolic, and I actually do not think this is an act of historical erasure, particularly since many of these are revisionist accounts of histories that come from the 1950s and 1960s and have more to say about white massive resistance to Brown versus the Board of Education than the actual Civil War or its aftermath.
Thank you. Any parting thoughts, Joanna Ando, Nyantara Anderson?
Yeah, I mean, Nyantara, you can go first.
Well, go ahead, Joanna.
Okay. No, I just wanted to echo that in terms of, I guess I wanted to first talk on the racist legacies, because again, I also get joy out of seeing the dismantling of a lot of these structures, which, like Calhoun College, was built in 1930, well after the Civil War, well after his vice presidency, and you know, having these structures of figures who actively perpetuated anti-racism, actively, and just like Woodrow Wilson, actively reversed Reconstruction and resegregated Congress, and has this legacy of portraying inferiority among Black and people of color. Like, I don't think that there is a space in which they should be honored in such a structural way. When it comes to larger figures such as Washington and Jefferson and even Yale, so much figures who have been so devoid from their complicated histories and now they represent other structures, I think part of it is first bringing that complex history back. And I think reuniting that, again, problematic that problematic aspect of the figure, because I think at these points, these names have taken on different faces and different forms that just erasing it is hard. So, you know, I think there are two different roles in which we can address, you know, the perpetuation of Confederate and anti or racist proponents, and then large, almost godlike figures in the US, such as Jefferson and Washington. I think there are two avenues, but I think they're both among the same lines of addressing the problematic aspects. Yeah, I mean, I want to leave some room for Neatara if you want to address that question or others, but.
I mean, so I want to start like Professor Murch with the discussion about Trayvon Martin's like guilt or innocence, or I want to draw a comparison between what happened to him after he was murdered versus what happened to someone like Brock Turner after he perpetrated a crime, right? So, you know, Michael Brown was killed, shot, the victim, and yet after his death, he was villainized. He was besmirched. He was accused. He was made post hoc, like rationalized as guilty, right? It was sort of a retroactive rationalization of guilt. And on the other hand, you have a young white man who was found in the act of committing a crime, sexually assaulting a young woman. And he was treated like a victim. His innocence was played up, right? The reasons he should be pardoned. And so when we are talking about, if we want to raise this topic of what someone like Michael Brown did or did not do, then I think we need to apply that standard to everyone. And we need to think about why we think about these things when it comes to Black victims of state violence, and then why we think of innocence and try to rationalize innocence in the case of white perpetrators of violence. And I just want to end by saying, in terms of the statues, again, if I don't live to see the end of the British monarchy, I'm glad I got to see these statues pulled into rivers, right? And in terms of the history argument, this is not erasing history. This is history, right? Like this, why is it that white men are history, but protesters gathering together to launch a global movement is not also history? If you stop people from doing what they want to do in the time that they are doing it, you are erasing history. You are preventing it from moving forward. So throw them in the river or gather them up and put them in a museum, take the paintings down, put them in a separate museum where if people want to go and contemplate that history, they can go and do that. But let us live outside the shadow of these racist, murderous, colonizers and rapists. Like, they do not belong in the public sphere anymore, and it's time that they either went into the water or into a museum so that the rest of us can just live our lives. And in terms of people like Yale, change the Yale University. Great, I'd be all the happier for it. And I also want to point out that Yale is a reprehensible colonial institution, and one of the things that it did was when Joanna talked about how it named two of the new residential college, the two new residential colleges named one after Grace Hopper, it simultaneously named the second one after Benjamin Franklin. So it's kind of like, you know, I think that these institutions are colonial institutions, and I think the way to think about how am I working against the racism that's here is to sort of think about it the way Fred Moten thinks about it, which is to work like a criminal, like a fugitive, like a decolonizing rebel, and to be just fully in opposition to the university and be fully disingenuous to the university, and to take what you can and not to revere it, and to be, again, out for its destruction in a way, its abolition.
I think we need to stop. This is so great. It would be fun to just stay on for another 2 hours and have you all keep talking and conversing about these topics that are just, like, there's so much to say and there's so much to do, and you're all inspiring and brilliant, and thank you so much for taking part.
Thank you. And as you can see in the chat box and Q&A box, people are really deeply moved. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, thank you.
And may we continue the conversation here at Yale
Excellent.
and elsewhere.
Together.
Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.